Niftakar meta fit-tlieta ta' wara l-ofsinhar daħħal rasu l-fotografu u qalli sejjer il-bidnija. Qalli kien hemm bomba. Jiena dak il-ħin għalkemm kont waħda minn dawk illi kontili ngħid imma dil-mara fil-periklu. Din hija persuna li jiena kont naf personalment ukoll ġifieri fl-aħħar mill-aħħar barra li hija mara. Kienet kollega, kienet persuna li kont nisma' ħafna. Niftakar dak il-ħin m'għaddilix minn rasi u ċempiltilha għax jekk ġara xi ħaġa l-bidnija hi l-ewwel persuna li se tkun taf. U minn dak il-ħin qisu kollox ħajja differenti.
It was like my life could not go on as it was. It was too much of a horrendous blow to just let it go by without making sure that it never happened again, without fighting for justice, without doing anything.
I do remember a meeting where my nephews were speaking and everybody sat spellbound, listening to what they had to say. And I remember things pretty much taking off after that one NGO after another became our allies in the fight for justice because they recognize this for what it is. It is not a crime against one family. It is a crime against the European way of life.
Il-mod kif esprima ruħu Matthew Caruana Galizia kien eżatt. Fis-sens li m'hemmx dubju kif qed li ommu inqatlet il għaliex kien hemm xibka ta' interessi kbar li anka kienu jwasslu għal nies fil-politika, nies għoljin fil-politika, li effettivament kienu qegħdin joħolqu din ix-xibka ta' korruzzjoni li Daphne Caruana Galizia kienet qed tinvestiga.
I feel as a European, as a Brit, as a Democrat, somebody who believes in democracy, it's vitally important that power should be held to scrutiny, and I feel passionately that justice has not been done in this case.
Meta tara l-Ombudsman jirrikonoxxi r-rwol tas-soċjetà ċivili, ma tistax ma tiftakarx fil-membri tal-Parlament, tal-Gvern, waqt li qegħdin nipprotestaw barra l-Parlament f'dik ix-xita kien kesħa, Novembru, Diċembru. Mhux sħana jkun hemm kesħa. Qegħdin hemmhekk qed jarawna nipprotestaw u narawhom mill-ħġieġ jagħmlu jieħdu selfies u hemm min ukoll qatt jagħmlilna hekk namġieni. Ġifieri x'differenza min suppost qiegħed jirrappreżenta lill-poplu fid-dar tal-poplu jiddieħaq bil-poplu.
The courage that journalists show and continue to pursue her investigations despite the risk involved is something that she would applaud.
Rridu nżommu f'moħħna li għal snin il-gvern dejjem kien ifakkarna biex inħallu l-istituzzjonijiet jaħdmu. Illum ħareġ illi l-istituzzjonijiet ma tħallewx jaħdmu.
It was like being hit in the stomach with a fist. When I heard about it, I was at home. I had probably just read her blog, and I couldn't believe it.
Sibtu ruħi involuta f'din il-ġlieda, ovvjament, wara 16 Ottubru tal-2017, ovvjament kulħadd għandu l-istorja tiegħu ta' kif sar jaf dak li ġara.
Suddenly I was living in a country where a journalist had been assassinated. That to me was unacceptable. I just couldn't get my head around it. These are things that happen in countries that you don't know, countries, third world countries, not up the road from where I live kind of thing. So yeah, it was personal. It was like an attack on someone who I loved.
Però għatmat li għaxina għadni zaħira m'għandix għalfejn ninvolvi ruħi, kulħadd kapaċi jagħmel xi ħaġa, kulħadd kapaċi jġib id-differenza bl-iktar mod li jista'.
So when we heard about the assassination, the first thing that happened was that there was a silent candlelit vigil that same day. Everyone met in Slema, which was Daphne's birthplace. Everyone was crying, holding candles. It was a very emotional experience, and there were a lot of people there.
It was this really absurd situation where for the first day or two, I didn't have any direct contact with my parents and sisters because I was at my other sister's home with her sons and her husband trying to manage things as they came in. And then at one point, somebody said, turn on the TV. And we could see there were people streaming out into the streets. I mean, this happened practically from the first day. People walked in Slema with a candlelit procession, leaving messages of hope. You know, in a time of darkness, that really made a difference to us. And then later on in the week, there was a protest in Valletta, the crowds were enormous. I remember that very well.
Dikinhar stess illi qatlu lil Daphne, grupp ta' nies marru ta' Slema u għamlu protesta spontanja letteralment, għaliex xem iktar spontanju mir-reazzjoni tal-espressjoni ta' soba. Meta dikinhar stess li inti tisma' bil-mewt ta' xi ħadd. Jien insertajt kont fuq il-television dikinhar u allura dik naħseb kienet l-unika protesta probabbilment fi 3 snin li mmissjajt. Imbagħad kien hemm oħra l-ħadd ta' wara organizzawha is-Civil Society Network u sidnuni biex nitkellem fiha u tkellimt fiha. Però dikinhar dik il-protesta kienet spiċċat quddiem il-qorti, il-post naturali fejn inti tmur biex titlob ġustizzja. U dik kienet lajta ta' kulħadd li trid issir ġustizzja li dan ma jkunx każ li mut fuq ommu, li nipprovaw ninsuh biex ma jkollniex fuq xiex ninkwetaw. Quddiem il-qorti hemm il-monument tal-assedju l-kbir li dikinhar spiċċa merreq taħt fjuri, xemat, messaġġi, posters, kartolini li ħallew tfal li żaru l-post. L-espressjoni ta' poplu illi rrid ġustizzja u rrid iwassal il-messaġġ.
So I originally involved myself in the fight for justice for Daphne by joining small protests that were being organized by friends of mine. I would get a message on WhatsApp or something telling me that people are going to be appearing outside Castile or somewhere similar, and if I would like to attend. I would usually, if I was available from work, I would possibly leave work and attend, because these were normally day activities. And from then it evolved. My involvement got bigger. I would write posts on Facebook that were attracting some following, and eventually this moved on and led to me speaking at various vigils and protests.
Niftakar illi jiena l-ewwel darba li involvejt ruħi kien bejtu xi 6 ijiem wara li inqatlet Daphne. Niftakar kien hemm manifestazzjoni organizzata dakinhar mill-Civil Society Network u jiena kont attendejt mal-mara u tfal u xi ħbieb u insertajt li kont ħdejn il-President tar-Repubblika. Bħal ħafna nies oħra li maġan bħal kważi kull min kien hemmhekk kont irrabjat ħafna għal dak li kien ġara. U kont mod partikolari f'dak il-moment anke dispjaċut għal mod kif il-President kienet ittekilja dik is-sitwazzjoni. Bażikament dik kienet qiegħda fuq vista statali u ddeċidiet illi ma tinterrompix, ma terġax lura qabel lejn Malta u derli wkoll illi lanqas tat il-peace neċessarju, il-peace mistħoq lejn dak li kien ġara.
His assassination was the spark, I think, of the growth of a civil society movement that we had not seen before.
Malta doesn't have a long history of civil society activism, and I think part of that is because we are such a small country. It's very difficult for people to speak out and voice their displeasure or discontent with people who either employ them or who they are dependent on for some sort of benefit or favor. So in Malta, I think we have a tradition where people grumble under their breath or rather try and convince the nearest politician to make things right for them. But that in itself is evidence of an eroding democracy.
In the few days just after Daphne was assassinated, I remember I was one of the ones who got together with other journalists, senior journalists in other newspapers and media houses, and we put together that little campaign where we blacked out our front pages and also the front page of websites, and had the pen will conquer fear as a sort of logo. That notably involved media houses from the Labour side as well, which was excellent.
Xi jumej wara l-assassinju ta' Daphne, grupp ta' ġurnalisti organizzaw Marċ il-Belt Valletta. U ċempluli għaliex jisu dawk il-jumej sir ġurnalist u għalu li mmur magħhom. U għamilna dak il-marċ u spiċċa qoddim il-qorti għaliex grupp ta' ġurnalisti għamlu rikors il-qorti biex jgħidu l-qorti tieħu ħsieb li d-devices ta' Daphne, il-kompjuter li kienet tuża, telefons tagħha ma jispiċċawx fidejn illi jispiċċaw jikxfu s-sorsi li kienu jgħinuha fix-xogħol tagħha. U dikinhar il-ġurnalisti qalu depend conquers fear. Il-pinna telep il-biża'. Imma jkolli ngħid jekk kien hemm 80 ruħ, hemm kien hemm 80 ruħ imbeżżajn. Għaliex dikinhar għall-ewwel darba ħafna ġurnalisti realizzaw li kienu fi professjoni li tista' toqtlob.
Dak il-mument u f'daw it-3 snin, kont nimmaġina li kien hemm ħafna iktar nies kompetenti minni u forsi il-kollegi tiegħi, però dak in-nies ma kinux hemmhekk, konna aħna hemmhekk illi konna din nimbuttaw biex issir ġustizzja. U jekk inħares lura li daw it-3 snin, jiena ninterpreta b'dal mod. Din kienet ġlieda magħmula minn nies ordinarji mingħajr xi ħila straordinarja, però b'determinazzjoni qawwija.
What I felt at that time was great frustration. That was, I think, the biggest, apart from the grief, the anger, and the fear, it was frustration. And then a friend of mine called me one day. Basically what had happened was that the opposition called for a debate in Parliament about what had happened. The government refused, and the opposition just sat there and took it. They didn't walk out. They didn't do anything. And at that stage, I think we realized that no one was going to take up this battle. And this great, great friend of mine called me, and she said, we have to do something. Are you in? And I said, yes, whatever we're doing, I'm in. And the first thing that happened was the Castile sit-in, the sit-in was done under the hashtag Occupy Justice. And that's how hashtag Occupy Justice started.
I cannot help to feel an immense guilt, something that has been haunting me for a year now. Why did I leave you alone? Why did I have to wait for the fatal thing to happen before realizing that you should not have been fighting this alone? I want you to know that women have been fighting for truth and justice. Occupy Justice was created because we thought that it is high time that in this country, women take a stronger voice, a voice that will carry yours for as long as we can carry it.
And from then on, we have been fighting for justice literally every day.
People think that because they speak amongst themselves or they speak in the various WhatsApp groups that it's enough. But physical presence at protests is really, really important. And it's one of the aspects that I think is most effective and is most forceful, because when people who are in power see that there is a physical presence, there are actually people in the streets calling them out and demanding accountability, it is far more effective than an article appearing online only or a handful of people meeting up.
F'Malta m'għandniex tradizzjoni qawwija ta' soċjetà ċivili attiva fil-kamp tad-demokrazija. Kien hemm forsi żmien fejn kien hemm il-grupp imsejjaħ tan-numri illi kien attiv f'dan is-sens, però l-bqija ma niftakarx jiena illi kien hemm dal-attiviżmu għad-demokrazija. Fil-mument li Daphne nqatlet għal parti mill-popolazzjoni dan inbidel. Parti mill-popolazzjoni Maltija indunat illi konna wasalna f'xifer l-irdum. illi ma stajniex inħallu fidejn il-politiċi biex jisolvuna dil problema għaliex propju kienu l-politiċi li daħluna fiha.
Ħadd ma kellu interpretazzjoni daqshekk skjaċċanti daqskemm kellu it-tifel ta' Daphne Matthew ftit sigħat wara li ra l-ommu l-aħħar darba. Fejn qal, isma' ngħidilkom x'ġara. Malta stat mafjuż u l-mafja qatlet lil Daphne. U niftakar ħafna nies jirrifjutaw li jaċċettaw dik l-analiżi, speċi qalu u hija dan għalfejn jitilef il-ommu miskin u min jaf allura x'inhu kemm hu rrabjat u x'inhu jgħid. Imma ma' żmien iktar u iktar bdejna lkoll nirrealizzaw l-elementi mafjużi ta' dan ir-reat.
So shortly after Daphne was killed, one of my nephews called Malta a mafia state. He was vilified for that and has never been forgiven for saying it. People keep throwing it back in his face, insulting him about it. But he had recognized something which people lived in denial of. People like to think they live in some sort of perfect tourist brochure where everything is perfect, where everything works, where the sun always shines and the sky is blue and people are happy. Sure, we're all of those things, but there's a much darker side as well. A lot of the easy money Malta came by, a lot of the money flowing through businesses over here into people's pockets. A lot of that is dirty money being laundered to seemingly normal projects. And the ugly thing about all of this is it was enabled by a government that was taken over by a criminal organization. That, in essence, is a mafia state.
Fil-każ tagħna mhux biss il-mafja topera, imma il-mafja marbuta sfortunatament ma' poteri politiċi qawwija. U dak huwa l-ar cocktail li jista' jkollok fil-pajjiż. Ġifieri jidhirli li Matthew Caruana Galizia kellu raġun jgħid, jida m'għandix dubju li Matthew kienet isegwi dak li kienet qed tinvestiga ommu. U allura dejjem kellhom kemm hu kemm il-familja tagħha ta' Daphne Caruana Galizia dejjem kellhom at the back of their minds kif jgħidu bl-Ingliż il-possibilità li xi ħaġa bħal din qatt tiġri. Niftakru li anke min irnexxielu jirreżisti għal ċertu żmien il-mafja fi Sqallija f'Palermo nsemmi Libero Grassi pereżempju li għal żmien twil għal ħafna snin irrifjuta li jħallas dak li l-Italjani jgħidulu il-pizzo biex iħallas dik il-ftit ta' flus biex ikun jista' jirċevi suppost il-protezzjoni tal-mafja. Anka dak effettivament inqatel tiri ta' revolver waqt li kien sejjer id-dar waħdu. Jiġifieri dawn l-affarijiet sfortunatament jiġru.
Il-ġirien tagħna l-Italja illi kellhom storja turbolenti tal-politika irnexxielhom isibu ġustizzja f'numru ta' każijiet. Tixħim politiku wassal biex ex-ministri issir ġustizzja u jintbagħtu l-ħabs. Aħna f'pajjiżna għadna ma wasalniex għal dan il-punt.
La mafia mette le proprie mani sulle istituzioni dello Stato. Noi abbiamo avuto un processo, il cosiddetto processo Stato-mafia, che ha dimostrato come le mafie fossero riuscite ad infiltrarsi in maniera così pervasiva all'interno dello Stato che addirittura alcune parti delle istituzioni generali delle forze dell'ordine, dei carabinieri in quel caso, alcuni uomini politici avessero fatto gli interessi della mafia e non dello Stato.
Assassinju bħal dan kien bil-fors sar minħabba li qarset l-interessi ta' xi ħadd li għandu poter kbir u li ħassu meddet. U dan għalija mill-bidu kien ċar, meta jkollok qtil assassinju ta' dan it-tip isir biss għal raġunijiet li huma strutturali li huma gravi, ma ssirx fuq pika personali bejn persuna oħra.
Jiena wieħed minn dawk illi meta smajt dan it-term stat mafjuż derli li kien xi ftit eżaġerat, derli li ma kienx jaqbel mas-sitwazzjoni preżenti. Iżda ma' żmien meta bdiet ħirġa l-informazzjoni, meta bdiet ħirġa l-verità fuq x'wassal għal dan l-assassinju, bdejt nara illi l-espressjoni stat mafjuż kienet qed toqgħod. Għaliex l-istituzzjonijiet ta' pajjiżna il-quċċata tal-poter qed nitkellmu fuq l-Uffiċċju tal-Prim Ministru, qed nitkellmu fuq instrument importanti ħafna fis-servizz pubbliku illi huwa il-korp tal-Pulizija jidher li kien parti mis-sistema illi waslet biex il-ġurnalista Daphne Caruana Galizia tinqatel u għalhekk sar iktar fitting illi wieħed jgħid illi kellna il-karatteristiċi ta' stat mafjuż. Ma ninsewx illi l-President tar-Repubblika fl-indirizz tiegħu ta' Jum ir-Repubblika fl-2019 u stess irrikonoxxa li kien hemm klikka u derlu li għandu jfakkarna illi r-Repubblika ta' Malta hija iktar b'saħħitha minn din il-klikka li ġabet għajb fuq pajjiżna.
Nżommu f'moħħna li r-Repubblika ta' Malta hija ferm akbar minn din il-klikka li ġabet dan l-għajb fuq pajjiżna.
Matthew meta kien qal illi ommu mietet il għaliex kien hemm stat mafjuż, għalija il-mafja jirnexxila taħdem meta jkun hemm l-impunità fil-pajjiż. U dak li qed naraw dawn l-aħħar 3 snin hija stat ta' impunità. Stat ta' impunità li qiegħed il-ħtija ta' dan l-assassinju eżattament f'saqajn il-gvern.
L'uccisione di Falcone e Borsellino, dei giudici Falcone e Borsellino, ha drammaticamente segnato la mia terra, la Sicilia, fino alle stragi del 92, del 23 maggio del 1992, del 19 luglio del 1992, cioè appunto le stragi di Capaci di Via D'Amelio, quelle che hanno spazzato la vita a Falcone e alla sua scorta, a Borsellino e alla sua scorta. E la mafia era quasi considerata come un qualcosa di accettabile e da quelle stragi i siciliani, gli italiani tutti, prendemmo coscienza di cosa fosse la mafia e quanto non si potesse rimanere indifferenti. Ecco perché io penso che Malta, con l'uccisione di Daphne, potrebbe e dovrebbe prendere coscienza.
Fil-waqt li kont naf, fil-waqt li kont konxu li hemm politika li tiffavorixxi l-ċertu nies, li l-ċertu business, li kien hemm il-korruzzjoni, bla dubju dak kont nafu. Imma iktar ma bdew ħerġin l-affarijiet wara l-qtil, iktar xorta qatt ma bsart li l-affarijiet kienu daqshekk gravi. Ġifieri li da pratikament kellek grupp ta' kriminalità organizzata li qed topera minn Kastilja. Għalkemm kont naf li l-affarijiet kienu ħżiena u kont dejjem kritiku ħafna tas-sistema li kienu daqshekk ħżiena u daqshekk gravi ngħid li le ma kontx naħseb li kienu daqshekk gravi.
Għaliex dal-pajjiż spiċċa kif spiċċa bir-reputazzjoni tiegħu anke barra minn Malta, anke fl-Unjoni Ewropea biss. Reputazzjoni hekk tant ħażina li f'daqqa waħda minn the Jewel of the Mediterranean, kif kienu jsejħula l-Ingliżi fi żmien ir-Royal Navy, sirna kważi the laundromat tal-Mediterran.
Kien hemm min qal dakinhar fl-ewwel sigħat, l-ewwel ġranet wara l-omiċidju ta' Daphne illi Matthew u l-familja kienu qegħdin jesaġeraw meta kienu qegħdin jirreferu għal Malta bħala stat mafjuż, mafia state. Illum ħadd ma tbaqalu dak id-dubju u kredit mertu ta' Matthew u l-uħutu illi kellhom għanduża kelma il-lungimiranza, jiġifieri l-foresight li tara l-bot. Li f'dawk l-ewwel mumenti hekk kif kienet ġiet maqtula brutalment ommhom, kellhom il-foresight, l-analiżi tas-sitwazzjoni ċara qudiemhom. Mafia state xi tfisser? Ejja nħarsu lura ftit. Mafia state ifisser meta kellek il-politiċi li saru kriminali. Il-kriminali li saru politiċi. Il-businessman li sar kriminali. Il-businessman li sar politiku. Il-politiku li sar businessman. Għandek inċest b'mod assolut bejn business maħmuġ ovvjament, mhux il-business leġittimu, il-business maħmuġ, il-business korrott, il-politiku korrott u l-kriminal.
L-istituzzjonijiet ta' pajjiżna kif kienu ddiżinjati minn dejjem kellhom aspetti fejn jaħdmu tajjeb u aspetti fej forsi jaħdmu inqas tajjeb. Però rridu nżommu f'moħħna li għal snin il-gvern dejjem kien ifakkarna biex inħallu l-istituzzjonijiet jaħdmu. Illum ħareġ illi l-istituzzjonijiet ma tħallewx jaħdmu għaliex tpoġġew nies illi poġġew il-lejaltà tagħhom lejn min laħħaqhom qabel il-lejaltà lejn l-istat.
Li jibqa' huwa il-kuraġġ ta' min effettivament jiffaċċja dan il-perikolu u minkejja dan il-perikolu jibqa' dej fl-interess tas-soċjetà.
There are times when reporting from Malta it feels like Moscow, and that's not good. The entire legal process has been horse before cart the whole way.
Naslu għal ġustizzja jekk din titħalla ssir. Permezz tal-inkjesti pubbliċi rajna kif saru ommissjonijiet kbar mill-korp ta' pulizija li jista' jkun li kienu mejjunin mill-Avukat Ġenerali. Dawn l-ommissjonijiet waslu biex il-perkors tal-ġustizzja jista' jiġi imxekkel. Jista' jkun li evidenza importanti kruċjali illi hija għandha bżonn titressaq biex jissolva dan il-każ din l-evidenza inqerdet.
Il-każijiet kriminali li hemm kontra dawn l-erba' persuni għandek il-hitman qegħdin jistennew għall-ġuri u s'issa ma jidher li hemm ebda indikazzjoni meta dan ħajibda. Mbagħad għandek il-proċess ta' Jürgen Fenech li huwa għaddej naħseb issa waqaf ftit lura minħabba l-perjodu meta kien hemm il-COVID u ingħalaq il-qorti fost affarijiet oħra. Waħda mill-provi ewlenin f'dak il-każ huma il-recordings li għamel bil-moħħi mill-ventewma tad-diskussjonijiet u diskursati li kellu ma' Jürgen Fenech u ma' nies oħra.
Mhux biss ostakli fejn għandek nuqqas ta' riżorsi, fejn kellek l-investigazzjonijiet anka mill-pulizija illi ma kinux monija bil-riżorsi meħtieġa sabiex ikunu jistgħu jagħmlu l-investigazzjonijiet kif kellhom bżonn. Żgur illi dawk ir-riżorsi li kellhom fil-bidu mhumiex ir-riżorsi illi għandhom issa, però żgur illi għandhom bżonn ħafna iktar riżorsi. Rajna wkoll ostakli fejn kellna il-unit tal-ICU, ġifiri il-unit tal-Economic Crimes Unit fil-Pulizija, illi ma mexxitx. Smajna fl-inkjesta pubblika kemm damu biex jiġbru biss l-informazzjoni mill-banek. Imma ma sar xejn iktar.
As we were going through investigations over the last 3 years, certain findings were pointing to certain conclusions. You have to keep in mind that journalists are very often working with part of the information. As we revealed what we knew along the way, the police were not acting on those findings. Journalists do not have the power to, interrogate people, go and seize servers, demand answers from governments. We do. They don't reply, and that's what it is. We can't demand that private companies and corporations and consortiums reveal their documents to us. Those investigations are the job of the police.
What was weird about covering the story was that there was a disconnect between what was being said officially and what, down the barrel of the TV lens, Joseph Muscat sat opposite me, saying, I'm innocent, I've been after Daphne's family, me and my family are the people who've been most grievously affected by this murder. And then the news has been coming out in evidence that Joseph Muscat's consigliere was inside the police investigation, getting briefed, and then he was talking to the prime suspect for paying the money. And the men who are accused of killing her, now they say they're innocent, but the evidence against them is compelling. These men were tipped off by somebody who had inside knowledge of the police investigation. And the person in the frame for that is Keith Schembri, the Prime Minister's own advisor. And the reason he knew who they were was because the Prime Minister and Keith Schembri had had a briefing from the police. The whole thing stinks to high heaven.
Law ħaġa l-gideb. Dak huwa aktar minn ostaklu, mhux vera. Gideb organizzat. Fl-ewwel ġranet, x'in ngħid ġranet, l-ewwel sigħat wara l-omiċidju ta' Daphne, Kastilja weldu u ħareġ mill-Uffiċċju tal-Prim Ministru apposta dal-għajdut. Giddieb, mhux veru, illi Daphne nqatlet bis-Semtex. Splussiv partikolari illi ġej mill-militar. U li Daphne nqatlet minħabba l-fuel smuggling.
Smajna wkoll kif entitajiet eżekuttivi bil-poteri eżekuttivi inħbew wara inkjesti maġisterjali, inkjesti li 3 snin wara għadhom għaddejjin u għadhom mhumiex konklużi. Pero għalija l-ikbar ostaklu jibqa' illi ir-responsabilità politika għal dawk l-allegazzjonijiet u dawk l-investigazzjonijiet kollha illi għamlet Daphne Caruana Galizia fejn jidħlu kuntratti pubbliċi, fejn jidħlu kwistjonijiet ta' korruzzjoni u ta' impunità f'pajjiżna jibqgħu mhumiex investigati u jibqgħu mhumiex solvuti. Għalija dawk huma l-ikbar ostaklu sabiex isseħħ il-ġustizzja ma' Daphne Caruana Galizia.
Mhux ostaklu li jkollok id-deputat kummissarju illi jħedja l-investigazzjonijiet kriminali. Minkejja li l-familja kienet qiegħda titlob minn hawn id-dinja dieta. Minn hawn id-dinja ikun pajjiż serju, jiġu minnu, isma' ħanajlek ara, jien miżewweġ Ministru, jiena qiegħed in charge tal-investigazzjonijiet fuq każ eminentement politiku, was a political assassination. Ħannersaq fil-ġemp. Le, il-familja talbet. Le, l-Avukat Ġenerali iddefenda dak il-konflitt ta' interess.
Any attempt to secure justice for the killing of a journalist is nearly futile. It is well established that most cases of killings of journalists go unprosecuted. Many go uninvestigated from the very start. So while this case has been difficult, I must say that there has been more progress in the murder investigation and in the campaign for justice than I have seen in most other cases of the killings of journalists that I have worked on. So unfortunately, it's par for the course. But that is precisely why we campaign for justice in emblematic cases like Daphne's.
Rrid ngħid illi kien hemm mumenti u meta jiena ħassejtni meddet, tlabt il-protezzjoni permezz tal-avukati tiegħi, tlabt il-protezzjoni tal-pulizija, dik il-protezzjoni ma ngħatatlix. U li kieku jiena ma kellix l-istituzzjoni tal-Parlament Ewropew illi kontinwament kont naf illi se tiddefendini, illi se tħarisni, kieku naħseb konna ndumu ħafna iktar biex naslu għall-verità li għandna llum.
Ostaklu it-teddit fuq ċertu nies biex ma jiġdux il-verità jew biex ma jiġdux kollox. L-ostaklu ta' ċertu leakages blajnuna ta' min kien lest jinxtara biex l-akkużat f'proċeduri pendenti jiġi mpinġi b'ċertu mod u l-pulizija li investigawh jintafaddel fuqhom.
Kien jinkwetani ħafna l-ewwel net l-investigazzjonijiet illi kienu qegħdin jagħmlu l-pulizija. U sa ċertu punt għadni ftit inkwetat fuq hekk. Minix qed ngħid li m'hemmx uffiċjali tal-pulizija tajbin u serji f'xogħolhom, assolutament li le. Imma kif tafu għaddejna minn momenti fejn kieku l-pulizija għamlet xogħla tajjeb kieku ma konniex ndumu daqshekk biex toħroġ il-verità u biex tibda l-inqas tidher li se ssir ġustizzja. L-eks kummissarju tal-pulizija, pereżempju, kien uffiċjali li aħna kontinwament kritikajna u bir-raġun. Illum ma ninsewx li l-eks kummissarju tal-pulizija hu stess jinsab taħt investigazzjoni.
U allura Mafia State huwa bħal pereżempju smajtu għandhom fil-xieta fil-qorti ikollok deputat kummissarju illi huwa miżewweġ Ministru illi ċempel lil assistent kummissarju hekk kif dan qiegħed fit-triqtu biex imur jagħmel intervista, tajdilix interrogatorju dik, intervista lil Jurgen Fenech fl-uffiċċju tiegħu ġewwa San Ġiljan, minn flok bata għalih id-depo, u interrogah id-depo, imma ovvjament hux il-majesta imperjali tiegħu Jurgen Fenech ma nibatux għalih id-depo, immorru għandu Porto Maso mus noqogħdu naqilgħuh, il-korp tal-pulizija hekk kien ridott. U sejjer id-deputat kummissarju ċempelli l-assistent kummissarju li jisma' ħares għax tinqalat għaliex is-sur Fenech ma jinflaħx mhux qiegħed l-uffiċċju ħalli għal darb'oħra. Okej ser.
Kif ġejja ta' Jurgen Fenech ġejja b'mod iktar komplikat li jismu nafux fejn sejra.
Il-preokkupazzjoni kbira tiegħi hi li ma' żmien l-affarijiet aktar jikkomplikaw ruhom. Li effettivament meta naslu għal assi u no, jiġifieri biex il-każ jiġi deċiż mill-ġurija fl-aħħar mill-aħħar, dawn l-affarijiet tant ikunu imħabbra li għamluha ferm aktar diffiċli għal ġurati li jaslu għal konklużjoni tagħhom. Se jien minix qed ngħid li dawna huma neċessarjament ħatja, jew min ħajtressa kompliċità fl-assassinju ta' Daphne Killed huwa neċessarjament, imma b'mod teoretiku qed ngħid li aktar ma jgħaddi żmien u aktar ma jkun hemm forsi pressjoni anke mill-medja fuq u focus mill-medja fuq ċerti każijiet, aktar l-affarijiet jistgħu eventwalment jikkomplikaw ruhom.
So the protest memorial was a spontaneous expression of grief by, I believe it was school children actually, who were in Valletta protesting or just expressing their feelings about the death of a journalist. They took flowers and they left them outside in front of the memorial, of the monument, the Great Siege Monument, which is in front of the law courts. In the first 11 months, the memorial was there permanently.
Kull jum xi ħadd mar reġa' fuq dak il-monument quddiem il-qorti u ġeddet dik il-protesta. Da sar għall-ewwel speċi ta' xrajn, ngħidulu hekk, imma ma' żmienu mbagħad spiċċa post mhux biss ta' soba, imma ta' insistenza illi ma tħallix il-min jinsa dak li ġara lil Daphne. U kien hemm naturalment min rid illi jitnessa dak li ġara lil Daphne. Allora jisu għaxxur ta' wara, jisu ngħidu is-sena ta' wara il-qtil ta' Daphne. Ma 16-il darba xi ħadd kien imur bil-lejl u jaqleb kollox. Jew jaqbad jaħtaf kollox u jitfaħħom fiż-żibel, il-karti, il-fjuri, il-messaġġi, ir-ritratti, jew iqattaħħom u jħallihom hemm biex juri l-isfreġu li jagħmel. Kienu jkunu bullies insomma, li jmorru hemm bullies li jistaħbew kienu jmorru hemm bil-lejl u jagħmlu din biċċa xogħol. Però dal-bullying mbagħad f'Settembru 2018, 11 xahar wara li qatlu Daphne, sar istituzzjonalizzat.
In September of 2018, a few days before the 8th of September, which is Victory Day and which is commemorated by a ceremony at this monument, the government cleared up everything from the memorial, and as soon as the ceremony finished on the 8th, they put up a barricade around the square, the area of the monument, and they closed it off. According to them, they said it was for renovation. On that day, on the 8th of September 2018, I was in Valletta and I took a candle with me and I left it there in front of the barricades. And from that day until January of this year, that memorial, the protest, has been there every day, removed every day and replaced every day. So it started off as a sign of grief and a reminder that we need justice and we want justice. And then it became a symbol of the fight for justice because the government kept clearing everything away, just throwing them in the bin. Literally, this is a fact. This is not just hyperbole. They took the posters every day and they would throw them in the bin. And we would go back and replace them.
We deserve better than our Minister for Culture and Justice, Owen Bonici, who, before he was elected, promised to fight censorship in all its forms. And now that he's a minister, he has become the censor himself. It is not normal that a peaceful, innocuous memorial site like this is cleared by Minister Bonici's ministry over 20 times and counting. We deserve the right to protest peacefully without consequences, without threats, and without censorship.
Personally, I haven't experienced too many negative consequences. I mean, aside from the elderly gentleman who used to sit beside the memorial and who one time muttered that we should all be sent to Auschwitz, the comments were limited to just, old men muttering under their breath and trying to intimidate us into staying away from the memorial.
Kien hemm drabi wkoll fejn sfortunatament mhux jiena biss, però ħanitkellem fuq innifsi ġejt attakkata minn xi ministru jew tnejn jew. Kienet ma ngħid xokkanti għaliex tistennija minn ċerti nies, però tal-mistija kieku kelli niddiskrivija kont ngħid li hija tal-mistija. Għaliex in-nies meta jaraw xi ħaġa bħal di, speċjalment nies tal-età tiegħi jew forsi dawk il-ftit żgħażagħ għadhom iżgħar minni li forsi jaspiraw li jkunu fil-politika l-qudiem jew li l-qudiem ikollhom il-kuraġġ, l-istess kuraġġ ta' ħafna minna li jiġġieldu għall-ġustizzja, dan naħseb jinbuttom lura ħafna.
I'm very stubborn. I don't like to feel that people can make me do anything. I believe that because really the government clearing it was a very stupid thing. They brought attention on it. When they weren't clearing it, it was just there. There was people weren't talking about it all the time. Clearing it every day made it a symbol, made it like a light shining on the injustice, on what they'd done. Very often when I used to go to the memorial, there'd be people there who would harass or heckle me, shout rude things, come and stand over me in a threatening manner to try and stop me from putting down the tributes. These people thought of this, we're told, I correct myself there, these people were told that what we were doing was hijacking the monument that was there to commemorate the Great Siege. The monument was not touched in any way, it was always there. What we did was put out our protest in front of the law courts. But people were told that what we were doing was wrong, illegal, that we were trying to commemorate somebody who they were told was evil, the witch of Bithynia, etc., etc. So for them it was an insult that I was what I was doing. They would pass by and tell me, oh, she's burning in hell and you're going to be there with her. These sort of things. It was upsetting. But, and there was a time when it was actually a bit dangerous because there was some physical contact with people. There were incidents that resulted in a broken mobile, for example. So there was a time when we were actually making sure that we didn't go on our own. We'd have a roster of people who could come with me so that I wouldn't be alone, and the same on the weekends if someone else went. This is just ignorance, basically.
Matul daw it-tliet snin fimt is-saħħa li jista' jkollha minoranza. Ħafna għandhom il-kunċett illi jew inti tkun ikollok l-appoġġ tal-maġġoranza tal-poplu warajk u allura tiddeċiedi kull ma jiġri fil-pajjiż, inkella inti tkun parti mill-minoranza u jkollok toqgħod tistenna illi l-maġġoranza tiddeċiedi għalik. Fil-verità, dak li għamel il-gvern hemmhekk permezz tal-Ministru Bonici spiċċa biex kien autogol kbir għall-gvern. Għaliex fil-verità din swiet ta' opportunità għalina biex nistabilixxu id-dritt tagħna tal-protesta. U allura li bdejna nagħmlu huwa attivisti varji iwaħħlu posters u banners ma' dal-fencing.
Bordni tal-Ministru Owen Bonnici kien responsabbli kemm mill-ġustizzja ironikament u kemm mill-kultura, ironikament ukoll għaliex xemm iktar kulturali mill-espressjoni ta' poplu forma ta' protesta. Dana qal li biex iġib il-paċi u l-ordni pubbliku dana jibbenja dan il-protest.
U f'mument partikolari il-kollega Manuel Delija kien għamel kawża kostituzzjonali li damet għaddejja diversi xhur u li eventwalment stabbiliet illi il-Ministru Bonnici ma kienx qiegħed verament ifittex l-interess nazzjonali, la l-interess tal-kultura, tal-monument fid-deċiżjoni tiegħu illi jordna illi isir restawr tal-monument, iżda għamel hekk biex joħnoq il-protesta tagħna.
Il-qorti tagħtu risposta u qaltlu mhux biss li kont tikser id-drittijiet fundamentali tal-bniedem, imma l-iskop li jintqatt li għalih kont qed tagħmel hekk biex toqqaf il-firda, mhux tal-li ma lħaqtux, tal-li dak li kont qed tagħmel kien intenzjonat biex toħloq il-firda.
It-tneħħija ripetuta tal-fjuri u candles xajdulhom, xemat li kienu għedin jitqedu fuq il-monument tal-Vittoria qudiem il-qorti ripetutament, dawka kienu jiksru wkoll id-dritt fondamentali tal-espressjoni ta' dawka li rridu jesprimu ruhom kontra dak li ġara u jesprimu il-disappunt u r-rabja tagħhom u l-opinjoni tagħhom dwar l-istat kif kienet jiffunzjona. Minn dal-każ tallimna li hemm drittijiet fondamentali li jistgħu jiġu asseriti minn ċittadini fil-kuntest propju tal-omiċidju ta' Daphne Caruana Galizia.
I think the first reaction was one of the realization that it can be a dangerous profession, of course. When journalists work on stories which affect or step on the toes of big money or criminal interests, then obviously there's a possibility that there will be retribution or even efforts to prevent information from coming out, which is obviously what happened to Daphne. I remember the first few weeks or even few months after the assassination, I became a bit paranoid with making sure the back door of the Times was locked, for example. So I admit to that. So there was a consciousness of the fact that there is peril associated with the profession.
I'm concerned about media freedom in Malta. I'm also one time I flew out there, I was writing helping Manuel Delia and I working on our book, Murder on the Malta Express. I hired a car, and instinct told me get the full insurance, even though it was expensive. And both car doors were kicked in, not kicked in, they were punched or kicked so that it would have cost me an arm and a leg. Now, I'd parked in a perfectly safe place. There was no reason to do that. I wonder whether the car had been got at. I know that Manuel and his family had been got at, been threatened, been jeered at. I was doing a piece to camera at some point while we're doing the Newsnight investigation, and there's a guy had a go at me, and I'm not a softie, so I had to go back at him, and he went away. But I am fully aware that people who stick it to their regime in Malta end up in trouble, and Daphne lost her life. So there are serious concerns. It's not just me who's saying this. The Council of Europe's rapporteur has said the same thing, far more eloquently.
Darba minnhom xi xarej wara li bdiet iċ-ċensura ta' Bonnici kien hemm il-mara tiegħi Clemens li kienet hemmhekk u aggredewa tnejn min-nies, weġġawha, isrula t-telefon. Kien hemm jien ma kontx hemm, imma kien hemm it-tifel tagħha hemmhekk u żgur ma kienet ċena li riditu jara.
Yeah. Hey, take my photo. You want to take my fucking photo, you? And my fuck you. Go fuck yourself.
Certainly we're talking about a situation where if people feared being killed before, they certainly know now that it is possible because it has happened to one of their own. Has the journalism itself changed? People are asking more questions, but journalism itself, as an industry and as a profession, has suffered enormously. The reason for that is market forces, the erosion that comes about because of social media. But one of the ugliest things about it is that it has become normal to heckle and to criticize journalists simply for doing their job. Journalists are doing a very difficult job in very, very difficult circumstances. Unless the system they work in changes, their job is going to become harder, not easier.
The shift was created a few weeks after Daphne Caruana Galicia's assassination because we felt that we needed to send an answer back to the perpetrators that you can't silence one of us. An attack against a journalist anywhere in the world is an attack against journalism itself. It's been 3 years now, and although it's been 3 years of justice denied, it's also been 3 years where we have learned that there are far more people out there than we think that there are, who believe in what is right and who believe that the fight is worth fighting.
Is-solidarjetà bejn il-komunità ġurnalistika lokali qed tikber, qed nara qed tikber anki fir-rwol tiegħi bħala President tal-IGM qed nara tikber, qed nara wkoll illi l-ġurnalisti iktar qed jirreferu għal xulxin u iktar qed jaqgħu għal xulxin fis-sens illi jistrieħu fuq xulxin anki bħala sorsi. Naħseb din hija wkoll sa ċertu punt xi ħaġa li nibtet wara l-assassinju ta' Daphne Caruana Galizia.
The challenges remain. They have not become less difficult. If anything, they've become more difficult. Whether it is verbal attacks by government officials, whether it's isolation, whether it's legal challenges, slap lawsuits that threaten to cripple us. We've faced a number of these over 3 years. But we are constantly encouraged by the public support that we receive.
F'soċjetà demokratika bbażata fuq is-saltna ta' dritt, il-ġurnalist għandu funzjoni mhux kif kien forsi dari fl-antik ta' sempliċi postier, postman, iwassal informazzjoni, imma anke li jissindika l-operat kemm tal-istituzzjonijiet tal-gvern kif ukoll anke istituzzjonijiet jistgħu jkunu privati bħal pereżempju entitajiet kummerċjali kbar biex jara li dawna fl-operat tagħhom l-għonet qegħdin jimxu fil-parametri tal-liġi u anke li mhumiex qegħdin jabbużaw mill-liġi u jabbużaw mill-poter tagħhom b'detriment għal ġid komuni tas-soċjetà. U l-ġurnalist investigattiv bħalma indubjament kienet Daphne Caruana Galizia dak huwa r-rwol tiegħu. Mela allura meta inti kollok ġurnalist li jinqatel meta u evidenti li dan inqatel jew din inqatlet minħabba l-investigazzjoni li kienet jagħmel jew kienet qed tagħmel, din hija xi ħaġa li propju timmina id-demokrazija f'pajjiż.
Irridu jkollna sistema politika f'pajjiżna li tapprezza x-xogħol utili li jagħmlu l-ġurnalisti. Irrid ikollna sistema f'pajjiżna fejn il-ġurnalist mhux infixkluh, nedduh, jew saħansitra noqtluh. Lill-ġurnalist anzi irridu ntuh l-għodda neċessarja biex ikun jista' jagħmel xogħlu ħalli iva il-korruzzjoni neqrduha ħalli iva ma jkunx hemm iktar ħasil ta' flus.
There is still that consciousness of danger. I mean, I'm not on the front line because I'm an editor, but I do know that stories that our reporters are working on do carry risks.
L'attentato di Daphne ha avuto un grandissimo rilievo sui media internazionali per tante ragioni. Innanzitutto perché si era ritornati a uccidere un giornalista. Noi in Italia lo sappiamo bene cosa significa uccidere dei giornalisti.
ċaġa oħra li ġrad dikinhar kienet il-realizzajt li kienu ġew ħafna ġurnalisti minn madwar id-dinja bil-mikrofonu f'idejhom isaqsu min jinterpretalhom x'ġara. Kif dil-idea li kellhom ta' Malta, ta' gżira ta' turizmu, gżira tal-holidays, spiċċat post fejn ġurnalista tinqatel f'karozza bomba. U mhux għax kelli xi spjegazzjonijiet li jitfgħu ħafna dawl fuq dik il-mistoqsija, imma xi ħaġa li ġrat lili u lil ftit oħrajn dik il-ġimgħa hija li spiċċajna inwieġbu l-mistoqsijiet tal-bqija tad-dinja fuq x'kienet jiġri f'Malta. Il-gvern kien għalaq il-bibin, ma rrid itkellem il-ħadd, ma rrid jispjega l-ħadd u ma kellux risposti x'jagħti. Il-Prim Ministru 4 wara li qatlu l-Daphne mar Joseph Muscat mar Dubai bih il-passaporti. U naturalment għal raġunijiet li wieħed żgur jifhimhom, il-familja ta' Daphne kellha ħafna affarijiet fuq moħħha, ma kienx ħajjithom ma kien issa ssir xi press conference fil-ġimgħa li ġarbu dik it-telfa.
It was very difficult to handle for us because the attention was focused on us when we needed it to be focused elsewhere, on the perpetrators, on the people who enabled Daphne's murder. So it was a very, very difficult time, especially in the first few weeks. But later we've started to find our feet. We made contact with international NGOs. I can't remember how that came about, but I do remember a meeting where my nephews were speaking and everybody sat spellbound, listening to what they had to say. And I remember things pretty much taking off after that.
I was in the BBC News Tonight office. I worked at the BBC then, and we see the story immediately that something very dark has happened in Malta. I knew a little bit about Daphne Caruana Galizia. I didn't know much, but I knew she was fearless, I knew she was brave, and she'd been blown up by a car bomb. I'm effectively the foreign fireman. I get to do these kind of stories, and I'm sent out as quickly as possible to Malta. And I can remember trying to get my head around the detail of it and being astonished by the stench of corruption. And what she said was that in the Panama Papers, there were 2 senior players in Joseph Muscat, that's the Maltese Prime Minister's administration, Keith Schembri, his consigliere, and this minister, Conrad Mitzi, and both of them had been identified as owing shell companies in the Panama Papers, and both of them were still effectively in power. And Daphne had really gone for those 2. She'd also gone for the Prime Minister and alleged that a woman, his wife, had received $1 million bung from the fabulously corrupt regime in Azerbaijan. And I was determined to get all of this in. Now my problem is I've got to deal with the BBC lawyers, who are generally wonderful, but I've got to deal with them. I've got to remember all the details. And I did my level best to, properly with evidence, inside the BBC guidelines, to stick the boot in, because I was appalled about this. When a journalist is murdered, it matters, not just to the people of Malta, the people of Europe, it matters to everybody who cares about democracy and scrutiny of power and the rule of law.
L-ewwel mod naħseb illi l-solidarjetà internazzjonali waslet biex l-istorja ma tmutx fuq omma. Il-periklu l-kbir kien meta inqatlet Daphne niftakar illi din kienet tkun sensation ta' ġimgħa ta' 15 u kollox imut.
I care very much about... Actually, I don't care very much about anything apart from powerful people saying, "You shut up." And I hate it. Listen, I love snoozing and I love going to the pub. But the one thing that gets me out of bed and keeps me out of the pub is when power and money says to poor people, "You shut up, you hold your tongue, or else." And Daphne is a hero to me. She really, really went for these corrupt so-and-sos who run Malta. And to shut her up, they blew her up in a brutal way. And the details of her death are awful.
The Daphne Project launched in April 2018. 1 week before the stories were actually published, we learned that there was a thing called the Daphne Project. We knew there were a group of journalists who were working on something. We knew there were many journalists working on something. What we didn't know is who was working with whom. We knew there was this organization called Forbidden Stories, which had been launched shortly after Daphne was killed, or around that time. We later learned that people within that organization were working together, people from different countries, from different media, pooling information, sharing what they found, working towards something which they eventually called the Daphne Project. It was significant for us that they called it the Daphne Project. But it matters in a bigger way. The whole point of the Daphne Project is to raise the price of killing a journalist.
Kellna wkoll il-fortuna illi kellna grupp ta' ġurnalisti minn The Daphne Project fejn fosthom kien hemm ġurnalisti Maltin, però kien hemm ukoll Reuters pereżempju, illi komplew jindagaw fuq informazzjoni illi anka tajthom jiena.
I thought he was a dodgy geezer, and I kind of wanted to wash my hands with soap at the end of interviewing him. I worked for the BBC then, and there are BBC rules, and I had to be careful. So I went through all the evidence. My colleagues at Newsnight helped me frame the questions. And towards the end, he was sort of smiling in this creepy, weird way. And I just thought, I want to give this guy a slap. And that's, I'm always in trouble at the BBC, I always was, so I couldn't actually hit the bloke. But what I thought was, well, think of a phrase which he won't like. And then I said,
the charge in a nutshell is that you're the artful dodger of Europe.
And he smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes, and I knew he hated it. And I said to myself, well, that's for Daphne. Fuck you.
I think it was pretty clear from the start that Daphne was killed because of her work. I think what has become clearer over time is that rather than being killed because of what she had exposed, she was killed because of what she was about to reveal.
I think the person who has got closest to the truth of articulating it or expressing it is actually Matthew Caruana Galizia. He had a post recently where he talked of the fact that had Daphne come out with more stories about 17 Black, it could have brought down the whole edifice of electrogas with all the millions there that people stood to lose. And not only that, but it could have triggered off a series of events which might have led to the government losing its credit rating.
The investigations by journalists over the last 3 years have continued to delve into the cache of emails, the leaks that she had on electrogas. The deal, very clearly now we can see that the deal would not have been possible. It would not have gone forward if Daphne was able to reveal what we now know.
A criminal doesn't just wake up in the morning and decide to kill. He's not a good man on the night he went to sleep and he wakes up a bad man in the morning. There has to be a series of crossing the line, so to speak, crossing the moral boundaries. Criminals might start off small and eventually their moral compass, if you like, becomes their own self-interest, their own self-preservation, and killing becomes just another step along the way.
Aħna naħsbu li fl-istrutturi ekonomiċi, politiċi tal-pajjiż kien hemm sitwazzjoni ta' inugwaljanza, sitwazzjoni fejn l-interessi tal-ftit kienu qegħdin jiġu kkunsidrati ħafna iktar mill-interessi ta' ħadd ieħor u kien dan il-kuntest, din is-sistema, dan it-tip ta' ambjent li wassal għall-assassinju. U fl-attiviżmu tagħna f'dawn l-aħħar ftit snin pruvajna nissotto linjaw dal-aspett. Il-fatt li jekk irridu li assolutament xi ħaġa ma terġax isseħħ, mela rridu nħarsu lejn l-istrutturi, xmar ħażin tul is-snin, inugwaljanzi u nindirizzaw dak.
Daphne nqatlet minn sistema ta' abbuż illi kienet ilha snin tifforma u topera.
Però ħaltru li kien hemm ostakli, ġifieri rrid ngħid mhux grazzi għall-gvern, imma minkejja għall-gvern li kien għall-gvern. L-ewwel ħaġa waqfu ma' 3 arresti, ġifieri li kien għall-gvern nkunu blank u ċari hawn. L-istorja waqfet f'Diċembru 2017.
Però huwa essenzjali wkoll illi insiru nafu l-verità dwar kull min kellu xi forma ta' responsabilità, kemm mill-assassinu nnifsu, kif ukoll minn dak li wassal biex jagħmilha possibbli biex l-assassinju iseħħ. Hemm min hu responsabbli għall-atti tiegħu u hemm min hu responsabbli għall-omissjonijiet tiegħu.
Għadni sissa jien ma morġ iċ-ċimiterju fuq il-qabar tagħha. U għadni ma morġ li xina qabel nara li dawk li kienu involuti fil-qtil tagħha kollha jinsabu l-ħabs. Mhux semmu fuq il-qabar tagħha kif forsi jagħmel kulħadd. Li xina wetta kif ġiet assassinata li mhux biss ħanara li l-verità dwar il-qtil tagħha toħroġ kollha, ma wetta wkoll li se nkompli nara li l-istejl li bditi jitkomplew sal-aħħar. Jitkomplew sal-aħħar għaliex bekk tkun tista' ssir ġustizzja dwar il-qtil magħha, dwar il-qtil tagħha.
Mhux ser ikollna closure qabel ma jkun hemm il-verità kollha magħrufa. U meta wieħed isib il-mottiv għalfejn nqatlet Daphne li elementari issa ċara naħseb li hija marbuta ma' kuntratt korrott ta' power station li ma kienx bżonn tal-elettrogas u dalwaqt naqraw x'kienet irċeviet Daphne fi frar tal-2017. Irċevit iktar minn 600,000 dokument minn whistleblower ġewwa l-elettrogas li kienu qed jagħtuha ċerta informazzjoni li kienet qiegħda taħdem fuq dik l-informazzjoni flimkien mat-tifel tagħha. Ħad nifhmu aktar għalfejn huwa ċar il-mottiv li kellha tiġi maqtula għal xi ġiet maqtula Daphne.
I went to Malta for both the first and the second anniversary of her death. On the first anniversary, things were glum. There was no serious movement in the investigation. Joseph Muscat was still in power, serenely, as his favourite adverb, as he likes to call himself, blocking any complaints about him, about his conduct. I believe I was the last person he dared, the last international journalist he dared grant an interview to. After me, he hid from the press, something of which I'm a little proud. But it was bleak. The second anniversary, completely different feeling. There was movement, you could feel the pressure. Things had changed. And our book came out. And I'm very proud, this may not, I don't know the truth about it, but what we heard was that it's clear in the book that Jorgen Fenech, who is the prime suspect for paying for the murder, though he is not alone in the conspiracy, he denies it, but there we are. Jorgen Fenech's in our book, and we pushed it. We had a chapter called All Concerned Deny Any Wrongdoing, and Jorgen Fenech is the last person. And there's a series of denials, one of which from him and his lawyers, one of which was, did you not suspect one of the men who've been accused of killing her gambled something like €500,000, close to €500,000 in his casino, but he was unemployed? Was that not a suspicious transaction? And we kept on running the follow-up questions. And then on the last page, there's a picture of Daphne. So if you're in the know, our book, without saying so, pointed the finger pretty bloody clearly at Jorgen Fenech. And then a couple of days after it was published in Malta, Jorgen Fenech gets on his fancy yacht and does a runner, and the Maltese naval ship stops him and brings him back, and he's arrested for conspiracy for murder. That felt like a good day.
Is-sitwazzjoni imbagħad ippreċipitat mit-tieni ġimgħa ta' Novembru tal-2019 il qudiem. Kien hemm mument speċifiku li kien il-mument meta Keith Kembri, niftakru dak iż-żmien kien iċ-Chief of Staff tal-Prim Ministru Joseph Muscat, iddeċida illi fl-awla tal-qorti iddeċida li ma jridx ixed għax inkella jinkrimina lil nifsu u saħansitra irtira il-proċeduri ta' libel li kien għamel fil-konfront tal-Onorevoli Simon Busuttil. Dik ħolqot rabja kbira fost il-popolazzjoni, kienu waqqa il-ġebla fuq sqajh, f'ngħidu bil-Malti, u niftakar li dak iż-żmien konna ddeċidejna li nagħmlu protesta nazzjonali. Kien ġej il-16 ta' xahar li fih aħna ta' kull xahar nagħmlu il-velja u ddeċidejna li dik il-velja nagħmluha forma ta' manifestazzjoni nazzjonali. Għal dik il-protesta attendew madwar 4,000 persuna, dik għamlet inna kuraġġ kbir, u meta mbagħad ftit tal-jiem wara dew ħerġin rivelazzjonijiet dwar l-allegat mandant tal-assassinju ta' Daphne Caruana Galizia u ġie arrestat il-middleman, l-allegat middleman fil-każ tal-assassinju, allura imbagħad kien iktar faċli biex in-nies ikunu mobilizzati.
Fi kriżijiet nazzjonali, is-soċjetà Maltija minn dejjem resqet il-vuċi tagħha. Però fil-kriżi li rajna illi seħħet wara l-qtil ta' Daphne Caruana Galizia, donnu rajna xi ħaġa ġdida. Rajna kif miż-żgħir sal-kbir kien hemm għaġġ kbir biex dan il-każ ma jitħallix għaddej u l-klassi politika tibqa' għaddejja qisu qatt ma ġara xejn. Kien hemm għaġġ għall-ġustizzja.
Had civil society not been functioning and had not been maintaining that pressure for the last 2.5 years, I don't think that the protests would have peaked as they did. You know, civil society was in place, it was organized at that time, it was available to basically call people to the streets, set up very quickly and organize big protests, the like of which Malta has not seen in a very long time.
Meta kellek l-eluq ta' Triq Sant'Anna, meta kellek it-tfieħ tal-bajt, kulħadd jiftakar meta għala bajda Owen Bonnici. Daw kienu aktar momenti fejn ir-rabja bdiet tinħassa vera u n-nies bdew aktar jifhmu l-implikazzjonijiet tal-każ, l-implikazzjonijiet dak kollu li kienet taħdem fuq Daphne, speċjalment fejn jidħol l-electrogas.
Minn dak il-mument għamilna kważi xarejn protesti nazzjonali kontinwi. Prattikament, kif konna nispiċċa protesta, konna nkunu diġà bdejna naħsbu f'oħra għal jumej wara. Il-punt l-iktar il-focal point tal-protesta kien quddiem il-Parlament. In-nies hemmhekk kienu jesprimu bl-iktar mod determinat, però fl-istess ħin paċifiku il-protesta tagħhom.
Minna lina l-estate il-protesta u l-organizzaturi morna nieħdu kafe, x'kienet kesħawek, morna nieħdu kafe. Daqqa waħda, dew jibatulna ħafna messaġġi. Li l-protesta reġgħet bdiet. U jiena vera xtaqt immur. Kien hemm min baqa' hemmhekk, imma aħna minna lina li spiċċajna. U ndur fuq sħabi. Għattura ma jħammorru. Għallunna le, dan huwa l-moment tal-poplu. Ħadu ownership tagħha. Vera, tista' dejjem tippjana. Però mbagħad kif iwieġeb il-poplu. U hemmhekk jiena lija kienet kruċjali li l-poplu ħarridni fideh.
Iva, jiena naħseb illi anka jiena kont ixxukjat il-klassi politika, klassi ta' politiċi f'Malta anzi, ftit li xejn għamlet effett li suppost kellha tagħmel. Anke meta nieħu jiena, jiena kieku taqta' lili, Simon, Jason, Beppe, Karol, ftit oħra, bħalissa ma nistax niftakarhom kollha, konna waħedna u mhux faċli li inti qed tiġġieled f'mument fejn f'dak il-pajjiż għandek l-istituzzjonijiet demokratiċi tiegħu maħkuma mill-gvern tal-ġurnata.
Konna qegħdin barra l-Parlament, kienet xita. Imma dulluvju universali kienet. U ħarisna madwarna jiena u sħabi l-attivisti u għedna ma fejn huma n-nies kollha konna nafu li irrabjati aħna il-poplu ma fejn qegħdin. Malli inxtelet il-mużika, laqqas fejn tiċċaqlaq ma kien hemm. U jien naħseb għax inti tista' bħala organizzatur ta' protesta tista' tippjana kollox u fil-ħin u fejn niltaqgħu u x'għandna nagħmlu. Però mbagħad fl-aħħar mill-aħħar ir-risposta tal-poplu tot.
Jiena kont nippreferi li kieku l-Partit Nazzjonalista kien aktar b'saħħtu f'din il-ġlieda kontra l-korruzzjoni, però naturalment minħabba raġunijiet li xi darba forsi nkunu nafuhom, il-Partit Nazzjonalista ma setax jieħu rwol illi ħadu sussegwentement Occupy Justice, l-Aqda Repubblika, Manuel Delija, dawn kienu kruċjali. ċaqlaqna il-fondamenti tal-gvern Malti biex jisiru t-tibdiliet li hemm bżonn isiru, t-neħħija ta' Joseph Muscat, t-neħħija ta' Konrad Mitzin, il-Ministru, t-neħħija ta' Keith Kembri, t-neħħija tal-Kummissarju tal-Pulizija, t-neħħija tal-Avukat Ġenerali. ċaqlaqna da kollu minħabba il-reżistenza illi mbdiet minn dawn laqdiet żgħar, għax irridu niftakru li Occupy Justice kien grupp ta' ftit nisa li ġew insolentati wkoll biex ma ninsewx, u ġew medda wkoll. Bad sussegwentement saret laqda Repubblika li bdew waħedhom u daw spiċċaw beluf ta' nies jipprotestaw fit-toroq.
Hemmhekk qiegħda d-distinzjoni, il-mod kif iħarsu lejna in-nies li neleġġu fil-Parlament. Illi huma jħossuhom li hemm tagħhom. U dak huwa l-iżball li jagħmlu hemmhekk tagħna. Hemmhekk verament tagħna l-kull. U l-fatt li ma ħallinix nidħlu dik għalija insult kbir. Meta l-ispeaker iddeċieda bagħat il-messaġġier li aħna persona non grata.
Ġejt konxju ta' kemm fil-fatt dawn il-protesti li s-soċjetà ċivili kienet qiegħda torganizza huma effettivi. Ħadd il-konferma fejn qatt ma stennejt li ħan nirċievi jew ħan nisma' il-konferma. Smajt din il-konferma b'widnejja fir-recording ta' konverzazzjoni bejn Jurgen Fennek u Melvin Tewma. Fejn qed jirreferu għal protesti. U jesprimu ċertu ammont ta' bl-Ingliż concern, tħassib. Għall-ammont ta' nies li qed jattendu, għall-ammont ta' nies li kienu favur il-kawża ta' Daphne, illi kienu qegħdin jagħtu każ, isma' jaf kemm ħajkun hemm nies il-lejla l-belt għallu wieħed il-ieħor. Jiġifieri kien hemm attenzjoni, kienu qegħdin jagħtu każ. Il-kriminali jagħtu każ, il-kriminali s-soċjetà ċivili b'saħħitha tbeżżagħhom. Il-protesti tan-nies fit-toroq, il-kriminal tbeżżaw, lill-politiku korrott tbeżżaw. U allura meta smajtak ir-recording fl-awla ngħid il-verità, jiena kont vindikat.
Jekk inħarsu għal Novembru, Deċembru tal-2019, jien ma ebda dubju ma kenniex il-maġġoranza tal-poplu warajna fil-protesti. Se nilludu ruħi li kellna l-maġġoranza tal-poplu magħna, però Joseph Muscat kellu jirriżenja xorta waħda. U allura jekk fimt ħaġa fim dik illi minoranza tista' iġib bidliet kbar fil-pajjiż.
Daphne's assassination was the spark, I think, of the growth of a civil society movement that we had not seen before. Eventually, again, as revelations started to come out about what might have lain behind her assassination, the stronger the civil society movement became. It's extremely admirable of people like Republica, Occupy Justice, to have articulated the outrage people felt and to have mobilized that outrage by getting people onto the streets. I think that is unprecedented in Malta's history because for the first time, such a movement was not led politically. So neither the Labour Party nor the Nationalist Party were involved at all. The opposition was very weak at the time, and obviously Labour was involved. So I think that I feel extremely proud actually to have contributed in a very small way to the movement by our media house, and also others have supported it formally. And that I think gives me lots of hope for the future. And I think any government has to watch out. So I think that the Maltese community has reacted in an excellent way in that sense. I mean, it's brought down a prime minister. That's brilliant. And may it happen again if we need to go there.
Galvanizzata tfisser ħajja, tfisser katalista. U żgur hija ħaġa tajba għaliex soċjetà illi hija reattiva, soċjetà illi trid li tara li klassi politika hija kontabbli għall-azzjonijiet tagħha żgur hija xi ħaġa tajba.
A lot has happened in the protest movement over the past few years. If I try to think of what is most significant about it is that it is happening at all. We don't have a tradition of protest. And protesters who have kept at the cause for all these years understand firsthand just how difficult it is to carry on with the cause feeling you're getting nowhere and being turned into a target yourself. The fact that people do it at all is the most significant outcome in the civil society movement.
Naħseb illi l-ikbar bonus point għal l-attivisti matul dawn l-aħħar 3 snin kien illi kienu kważi waħidhom qegħdin iżommu lill-gvern to account.
I think that there should have been more anger at the fact that a journalist was killed in a European Union country. We got lost in the detail of who she was, what she did, as though anybody deserved to be killed in that way. But I think one remarkably positive thing that emerged out of this situation is the power of civil society. The fact that a group of individuals, largely led by women, managed to get thousands of people onto the streets. In a political climate like Malta, Malta is not the kind of place where, you get people protesting on the streets, to voice their concerns, to voice their opposition on one issue or another. Unless a political party leader, raises the flag and says, "Follow me," you wouldn't normally get this kind of reaction. And that led to the resignation of those in power, those people who everybody thought were untouchables. So that, I think, is a remarkable achievement. I think this movement managed to, raise awareness that democracy is not something that happens once every 5 years. It's a duty of every citizen every day.
Il-ġurnalizmu, l-attivizmu, l-aċċ tal-ġustizzja ta' nies li huma ċittadini u li ma jifilħux jaraw inġustizzja bħalma saret lil Daphne issir f'pajjiżhom. Dawn huma l-elementi li waqqgħu lil Joseph Muscat. Joseph Muscat kellu awtorità elettorali enormi. Jien naħseb li kieku sejjaħ l-elezzjoni f'Novembru li għadda kien jerġa' jerbaħa bil-kbir. Imma awtorità morali qatt ma kellu. Imma sostenibilità tal-gvern tiegħu tilifha wkoll. U tilifha b'milu. Tilifha għaliex meta sal-aħħar ġurnata żamm miegħu lil-Keith Kembri u l-Konrad Mizzi assuma bħala tiegħu il-ħtijiet tagħhom. Meta proteġihom imma, meta ma ħallix il-min irid ineħħihom anke fil-partit tiegħu stess, mhux biss għamel tiegħu il-ħtijiet tagħhom, imma assuma ħtija partikolari tiegħu u kellu ir-responsabbiltà li jipproteġi lil Malta minn dak li għaddejna minna dal-aħħar 7 snin. Il-Prim Ministru ta' Malta għandu ir-responsabilità li jieħu ħsiebna. Għandu responsabilità li jżomm il-bot minna it-teddida tal-kriminalità. U minflok fetħilha l-bib. Minflok liġġem l-istituzzjonijiet li kellhom jiqfula l-kriminalità. Biex dawk fil-qaqoċċa tiegħu u min jafx involviment dirett kellu ikollhom il-possibilità li jagħmlu il-flus maħmuġin u notfa mingħajr ma jindaħlilhom ħadd.
Daphne was killed because of what she knew and because of what she was doing. She would never give up. The people who killed her really felt they had no other choice, but they were wrong. They did have another choice. They could have done things correctly. Why was Daphne killed? Because she knew too much for them to live with. They knew they would be exposed. They knew she would expose them. They knew that nothing would stop her. They tried everything. They threatened her, they blackmailed her, they vilified her, they isolated her, they sued her, they threatened her, and she never gave up. And then look what happened now. They killed her, but her work's continuing. And slowly, one by one, they're all coming undone.
Xirrid isir biex issir ġustizzja ma' Daphne Caruana Galizia? Faċli. Li kulħadd jieħu dak li ħaqqu.
All those involved, all those who let it happen, all those who could have stopped her assassination, all those who should have been investigated and weren't, all those people need to pay the price for what they did. Maybe that would be enough.
Il-ferita għal-familja ta' Daphne Caruana Galizia mhux se tingħalaq qatt. Imma l-ferita nazzjonali tista' forsi tibda tingħalaq meta tinkiseb il-verità.
I think justice will come if the Labour Party is booted out of power in the next election. I'm not a nationalist. I've voted for small parties throughout my adult life, as well as big parties. I think the people need to give Labour the message that, hey, this is just not on. It's just not on to allow the assassination of a journalist.
Jiena nemmen li presidenti futuri qatt jagħtu ir-rispett dovut lil Daphne. Nemmen illi l-istudenti fl-iskejjel qatt jiskopru kif Daphne hija eroj Maltija.
Tistax issir ġustizzja ma' Daphne. Daphne mietet. Daphne ma tistax tinġib lura. Ġustizzja tista' ssir fuq il-fatti, tista' ssir ma' dawk in-nies li tinsaq issib il-mandant u timxi skont ir-regoli tal-liġi u tara fejn x'ikun ħaqqu min ikun għamel dan ir-reat. Imma ġustizzja saċ ma tistax issir għax il-mejtin ma jistgħux jerġgħu jitqajmu.
We have to start with making sure that everybody is equal before the law, and those who have escaped justice so far, those people who are still pulling the strings and yet are not in the dock, those people must answer immediately.
The story does not stop with Jorgen Fennick. It does not stop with these three hitmen. There are others who were aware of this, who may have been involved in ordering it, who may have been involved in facilitating it. Every one of these people needs to be identified and prosecuted, and only when that happens will we consider justice to have been fully served.
Kull min fil-politika jew f'xi post uffiċċju pubbliku wettaq sens ta' impunità naqas bid-deċiżjoni tiegħu jew ħa deċiżjoni illi għenet sabiex toħloq ċirkostanzi li fih seta' jitwettaq dan l-assassinju, dawk ukoll iridu jerfgħu ir-responsabbiltà politika.
There needs to be an overhaul in our education. People need to understand the role of the media in a democracy. They need to understand that even if a journalist says something that they don't agree with, doesn't mean that they should vilify them or that the journalist is the enemy.
Avere verità e giustizia per Daphne significa individuare non solo i responsabili di quel drammatico attentato, ma anche i mandanti. È quello che voi, maltesi, dovete chiedere a gran voce.
We have to stop protecting politicians as if they are these football players with this blind loyalty to politicians, no matter what they do, no matter how much they steal, no matter how disrespectful they are to the electorate. And we have to, I think, respect ourselves a little bit more.
Ġustizzja hija fil-punt li aħna nkunu indirizzajna il-fatturi strutturali li waslu għal xi ħaġa daqshekk traġika.
And I think no stone should be left unturned, and that includes former Prime Minister Joseph Muscat. He has questions to answer. So has his chief advisor, who is still, at the time of speaking, at liberty. Knowing the evidence that's been aired about that man, I find that astonishing.
Biex ngħid li f'dal każ ta' Daphne Caruana Galizia ngħid li tkun seħħet ġustizzja, irrid nara li kull min kien responsabbli għal mal-amministrazzjoni ta' dan il-pajjiż ma jerġa' qatt ikun fil-poter.
L-ambizzjoni tiegħi għall-ġustizzja hija triq itwal minn hekk. L-ambizzjoni tiegħi hija li nkunu ngħixu f'pajjiż fejn il-valur li tiddeċidi qed ilu x'tajjeb jew le mhuwiex imkejjel kemm jaqbel lill-partit tiegħek x'tajt fuq hekk. L-ambizzjoni tiegħi ngħixu f'pajjiż fejn inti tiġġudika l-korruzzjoni mhux għax għamilha l-Ministru tal-Partit tiegħek jew il-Ministru tal-Partit ieħor. Irid ngħix f'pajjiż fejn dak li hu sew u dak li hu ħażin u ħażin.
We've always maintained that justice for Daphne means two things. Justice for her murder and everybody involved in it, and justice for her stories. She died because she exposed corruption. She found corruption because she was covering politics, when by covering politics she discovered crime, and so she was killed. So what we need to see is everybody in her murder brought to justice, and everybody involved in the crime and corruption she uncovered brought to justice as well. And it looks increasingly like there are people in those two groups who are one and the same.